So I wanted to talk a bit about mirrors. I got a couple of emails about it after I put it in my article on Medium and why I have taped up mirrors everywhere, and I guess withstain from staring into mirrors. Well, I think like all of my experiments, it starts off as just kind of a notion of, okay, well, why do I do this? Why do I look in the mirror, spend so much time in the mirror, kind of caring for myself, it feels like, and trying to figure out what is that about. So the mirror itself is kind of just an interesting phenomenon. Or it's an interesting object, and it's enchanted in some ways in our modern society. The face is obviously a very, very important aspect of modern life, and keeping that as tidy as possible has become kind of the norm. So there's a lot of things that we just kind of accept as, okay, well, that's normal. So we should be doing that, and mirrors are fine because mirrors are everywhere. And it was when I went to Shanghai that I really had the experience of what a mirror was. Now, previously, I still don't have a phone now, but I gave up my phone about Liang Nian ago. That's Mandarin for 2 years. And there was an incident that occurred, and then I chose to continue without it. And there was this kind of methodology that took place that I'm using in the mirror experiment. So the method is what I've been calling jianfa, which is Mandarin for subtraction. So it's kind of this method of subtraction. And so what it is if you want to find out about something, if you want to know what it's like, in a sense, there's several ways you can experience it, and obviously there are a multitude, if not an infinite number of ways to experience it. You cannot exhaust anything. I can take this microphone, for example. It contains plastic, and there's lots of ways that I can look at plastic. I can look at it as a bad thing for the planet ecologically. I can also look at how smooth it makes things. I can also, if I'm in a different mood, see it as a different, in a different light, and in the way that all these other variables in the environment affect this microphone. Seem like a finite amount of things, but actually it's infinite because you can continue to exhaust those things and use various elements. And there doesn't seem to be an end to me exhausting this microphone. But what we have to argue is there is a distribution of ways to look at this. There's a distribution in which people have chosen to look at these things called microphones. And in fact, calling it a microphone is a concept over and above the material itself. And it doesn't have to be a microphone, because sometimes it's just a lovely snowball, right? Sometimes it's just a symbol of my interest in music for some people. It could be several things. The fact that I call it a microphone narrows it for me to simplify it and make it predictable for people about what it is. So with that being said, there's not only a distribution of the ways that people look at certain things. It's clear that this brain here is looked at in several different ways, but there is a primary way of people using it in different domains, from different backgrounds and different practices and different moods. And so there certainly is a distribution, and that distribution is likely something like a power law, or probably some Pareto distribution. But the point I'm making is that there is the conventional usage which creates such distributions, and of course there's utility, functional, a lot of things that go into that. So if we try to consider this brain here, and we try to consider, well, what out of all the ways, the infinite amount of ways to see this object, what are the more correct, or let's not call it more correct, let's call it what are the ways that I can see it that could help me improve the way I see the world and the way I act in the world. And when we do that, we definitely narrow the sample space, right? We narrow the space of possibilities of ways of seeing it. Now, it could still be near infinite. Now, remember, there in mathematics, there are different types of infinity. So, in this case, we might be having the smaller of the many infinities that is possible, but let's imagine there is a finite number of ways of seeing this in ways that it would improve my behavior to help me be strive to whatever goal that I'm trying to get at. One way to see it is I could see it as an emblem or a symbol of I can put it out as a status object and I see it as primarily of my focus on intellect, my focus on cognition, and I could see it as a symbol. And that's one way to see it. And if I saw that every morning, or I even had practices or rituals around it, I could take that lens at which I chose to see it or came about seeing it, and it could be useful in helping me remember that it's good to reason, it's good to think this way. Another way I can see it is the way I've been seeing it. This was actually recommended to me by an amazing neuroscientist at Stanford, and who also gongzod or worked at the same design place that I worked at. And it was because I was studying the brain. I was trying to understand the neuroscience literature and really get an understanding of it. And of course, there's really multisyllabic words and jargon that is used, and I wanted a more spatial, physical understanding of what was going on. So when someone says prefrontal cortex, I know where that is, and I understand that, and there's lots of reason why that's good in the neuroscience case. We know that the projections into different areas of the brain, although they are not really solidified areas in the real sense, but let's call these heaps or skandhas. These areas allow us to talk about these different areas in ways that can be useful. Now, it matters less that what the exact reality is at such a precise level. So this level of resolution for me is to talk about the prefrontal cortex as being a part of decision making, and talk about the limbic system, the area more in the this area where you have the hypothalamus and a lot of things that we call lizard brain, things that we kind of associate with old brain or archaic, or the archaeology or the Jack Panksepp's like archaeology of mind talks about it in these sort of ways, and he tries to actually take away the bias that we have for these ancient brain regions and gives reason why they're really suitable to have them today. It isn't like if I just took out the limbic system that everything would be functional and fine. But instead, let's get back to the topic. Sorry, the idea here is that I have a simple kind of thumbnail picture which to see the prefrontal cortex, and that gives me a view into the brain. And now you have to ask, how useful is it to have that sort of view of the brain? And for me, it's been extremely useful because I have multiple lenses and that kind of map roughly to multiple parts of the brain that allow me to talk about human behavior in a way that talks about it at the neuronal level and also the functional neuroscience level. So knowing what goes on in the brain, knowing that what adolescence is about is, or at least a large part of it is really enhancing or maturing this part, because our prefrontal cortex, it doesn't mature until our mid and late 20s, typically on average. And what that means is that we have an excess of connections in there, like never before. And what we're trying to do is synaptic pruning happens, where we're going to have a lot less connections in the prefrontal cortex, and those are going to make our behaviors a lot more stable. So when I'm talking about teens or people who are adolescents versus people who are 40 or 50 or so, there's ways of thinking about the way they behave and their consistency in action and their ability to be consistent and resolute on some of their mindsets. This sort of conception allows me to talk about it in this way. So then I believe, from what I've just told you, just given that understanding. Now, I do have a deeper understanding of the brain than that, but with that simple schematic, I believe it proves that this is a useful way for me to consider human behavior from the perspective of neuroscience, and I could also talk about it in different ways that allow me access to it. So now going back to the main topic, which was the mirrors. Now, mirrors, they are there for you to look at and clean yourself up and not look like a fool. We even know that there are primate studies that show if a monkey, or I believe it's a chimpanzee, if there is powder on its face, right, 红色的 or red powder, then, and you give it a mirror, it knows the distinction between what we would call a self, itself, and other, and it makes this distinction by taking off the 红色的 powder or red powder. It's actually 黄的 黄色的 not 红色的 which is orange. So it has this sense of difference between, it has this distinction that it's able to draw, just like we are. Now, my decision to not use the mirrors is it's complicated in a sense, because I feel like I've been slowly trying to let go of myself, and now I never really came to this by using any sort of technique like mindfulness or Buddhism, because I think these things, this sort of thing sounds like that sort of practice, but in all honesty, the reason I gave up the mirror is because it seemed an awful wrong use of someone's time. And so what I want to encapsulate here is this is only one thing that I've done with, and there's actually a laundry list of other things that I've done to let go of this idea that part of my value in the world stems around how someone sees my bag of bones, in a sense, or the cover over my bones. And so the problem with that is I'm not alluding or convinced that will ever go away at this point. And also, if you follow the biological and evolutionary literature, you'll know that the beauty in nature, I would say a lot of the color in nature is literally just due to sex. It's due to attraction. The reason you're attracted to a flower or hua, is because it's attractive, and it's trying to attract bees. So it's about reproduction. So why are humans, interesting thing is, why are humans attracted to things that bees and birds are supposed to be attracted to? And I believe it stems back from an evolutionary perspective, is that we do all come from, if you believe the latest microbiology or cell biology literature, which is, there were prokaryotic cells without a nucleus, and we're mostly talking about mitochondria, and this was kind of the most ubiquitous, I believe it's still the most ubiquitous species or organism on the planet, and from there was what Lynn Margulis called, and I believe she came up with the term symbiosis, in which there was quite a war going inside of a cell, likely, I believe it was phagocytosis, and this is when a cell consumes another cell. This part is still needs much more evidence to support, but the basic idea is that we all started from a quite similar first eukaryotic cell. May not have been the first, but a eukaryotic cell that survived enough to multiply, reproduce, and create the basis of fungi, plants, and of course animals, such as ourselves. And so the idea that I'm trying to get across here is that we are super connected in this way, that we have been obsessed with trying to disconnect that connection. And the mirror is actually a part of that, right? So the reason we probably see Hua as beautiful, and that we've even made rituals and tons of practices all over the world around them, is likely because we contain some of the same machinery, and there is some basic building blocks of biology that enable this to happen. Now, that's my theory of it, and that's how I read the literature and synthesize. So, with that being said, there's a really, I guess, quite contentious at the moment, or not contentious, but controversial, or was controversial, Brett Weinstein, who is a evolutionary biologist. I like the way he talks about it, because he talks about it in the sense that we have our biology, and there are certain ways that our biology plays out. But what seems to be clear out of the very, very narrow sliver of human exceptionalism, meaning, in my view, humans are have exaggerated our own exceptionalism to an extreme degree by enchanting certain differences, like emotion or love, or things that I believe to be, by my reading of the literature, much cheaper than anyone ever imagined. And because we've done this human exceptionalism thing, we find it an insult when someone calls us a monkey. But it's not clear that being called a monkey should always be taken as an insult. And in some instances, I'm sure people are actually saying, you seem very limber and flexible, and that's a good reason to be called a monkey. But there doesn't seem, we've kind of limited the distribution of being called a monkey to quite negative area. But getting back to my point, we don't have to stick with the biology that we have. There are certain things that have been great for us and that we've carried over, such as things like religion. But it's not necessary to continue those because evolutionary biology says so. And in fact, we're already showing vast changes in interrupting the biological process. But in the same time, we can't even say that we're interrupting it, because it's also the case that it is the biological process. So when we think about mirrors, they end up, I believe, the distribution, if we looked at the distribution of how they are used and how we tend to feel about mirrors, and they are primarily aesthetic and about looks and about also, looking cleanly, and lots of things that have lots of research that is a good thing to do, especially if you're sick. But also just because the way that people process you, at least neurobiologically, if you have something in your teeth, you can have someone have a reaction in their insular cortex and have some sort of gustatory disgust just on the basis of having something that's unpleasant to them. So there is an argument to do such things, to stay in the mirror and to spend part of your life in the mirror, picking things out and really worrying about that. But in my experience, this obsession with the mirror has been more about or I would say it's been better at bringing about anxiety, bringing about fears, and much less so. I don't believe it's a net positive in my view, at least not to the individual. It has helped society sever itself from what we now call nature, which is bizarre, because now we are this kind of cosmetically cleaned up, always trying to pursue, the Instagram perfection every instance of life is not only not a good way to spend your time, but it's also not good for you psychologically to be worrying about, do I look pretty today? And so, and obviously, if I have to enter the gender or sex, whichever one you like, obviously they're both very different. They are correlated and overlap in very interesting ways that we can't even imagine using simple logic. But the basis of myself doing that, and I know many people might identify me as masculine or as a male, which I do not identify with, although I do believe I have masculine qualities. I don't identify as a gender or a sex, but I'm perfectly happy to talk about the specific things that are needed when we talk about these things. So if I'm at a doctor's office and they want to know my gender, well, that's not really the question they're asking. Or they want to know my sex. I don't believe they've ever asked me for my gender. I don't believe, unless... But in this case, they're not actually talking about your sex. They're talking about something that falls into the category of that sex, which is a skanda. It's a heap already. It's very hard to draw a line, draw a boundary. But they're talking about specific things. So it might be your hormonal levels, right? Your hormone levels of estrogen and testosterone. And maybe that's what they want to know. Now I believe that's a more accurate question, but we use the sex as kind of a suitcase term. Now there might be a combination of things that we tend to define as sex, and those things can be very helpful in certain diseases that you might have, or might be more privy to, given you have depending on your genitalia. So, and that was a kind of venture off by saying that when we identify ourselves, we have no, this is probably another video, so I won't go into that direction, but when we think about going back to the mirror, using our time this way, I taped up all of my mirrors. I gave up my pocket mirror, and I just stopped looking at myself in public mirrors as well. And what I quickly found out is, I believe the first thing you do, you find out when you do these subtraction experiments, is you find out what all the other people are doing, and it's kind of like being at a zoo. And you find out, like, again, when I was in Shanghai, on the subway, or in the DT, there's so many mirrors, and people are constantly staring at themselves, fixing themselves up, and making sure their hair is doing well and so forth. And so the moral of this is that people spend a lot of time on it. People are highly anxious about it. People suffer a lot because of their attention to this physical self. And the problem, if we could be permanent, if we can be static like the images on Instagram, if that was the reality we were in, if that was the universe we were in, then it wouldn't make sense because you wouldn't need to change anything. But what I want to point out is the problem is we're impermanent. And so ultimately, the face that you looked at the beginning of this video is no longer the same. And it's not only no longer the same, but I am actively, if I do have a mirror, or when I did have a mirror, chasing certain me's of the past, the things that I identify with as, oh, that was me at my best. And there's this kind of chasing, and the chasing is impossible. I mean, the goal of the chasing is impossible to reach. And so it's impossible to reach. And then if you try, where do you end up? You end up probably aging not as well as you could be, and because you're still worried about this, and you're still clinging on to this identity of yourself, this physical structure, and it's passing away, and it's always passing away. And in this video, there's probably a few thousand cells in my face that have died, and some of them have renewed, and perhaps it's getting weaker as I get older, and perhaps I'm going to feel a lot of suffering because I'm holding on to it that way. So the argument for no mirrors for me is what's happened since I've had no mirrors, which is things have really changed in some sense. Like, it's actually, sometimes I do see myself as in public, and it's usually an accident. In the beginning, it wasn't an accident. It was more of like, wow, I don't know where my face is. Where is it? And what happened to it? And what's happening to it? Is it okay? But now it's much more kind of funny, because sometimes I'll catch myself in the mirror, if that's myself. And it'll be kind of funny to see that, oh, wow. Who is that? And it's almost like a stranger. It's almost like I've been flying around in space, and then there's a physical character on me. And it's quite interesting because I feel distance, a certain sort of detachment to what someone would say, what they look like, and the conclusion here is that I have a specific goal where not being in the mirror is a really good thing. I work at a consultancy where mirrors are said to be stereotypically important, given that a lot of our work ends up being client work. And so meeting clients, seeing clients, dealing with clients. And so the level of attraction, I believe, at consultancies in general, maybe not the one I'm at, but in general, is probably a lot higher than other organizations due to the nature of the work and the practices. And I believe that's wreaked a lot of havoc on consultants and people who put a lot of self-worth into this sack of bones, and perfuming it and lotioning it and waxing it and shaving it and prettying it up and all those sorts of things that are important, and staring at it and feeling anxious about it. And so what if your work was really judged not by the content of